More than 5 decades of war appears to be over as the Colombian Congress ratifies a new peace deal with FARC rebels. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. More than 220,000 people dead, as many as 5 million people displaced. That's more than 1 out of every 10 Colombians. But on November 30th, what began in 1964 with rebels wanting to forcibly redistribute wealth appears to have ended when Colombia's legislature formally ratified a revised peace agreement. The new deal includes 50 changes to an initial one narrowly rejected by voters in October. Among the modifications, a commitment from FARC to forfeit assets, some achieved through drug trafficking, to help compensate victims of the conflict. Under the agreement, the rebels have up to 6 months to demobilize, disarm, and report to camps, which are overseen by a United Nations peace force. But FARC is already balking until they say an amnesty law is in place, pardoning rebels not accused of war crimes. There's much to talk about, so let's get right to our panel. Joining us here in Washington is Diana Castaneda. She's an award-winning journalist and anchor for NTN 24, an international Spanish-language news channel. Michael Shifter is president of the Inter-American Dialogue, a US-based think tank focusing on Latin America and the Caribbean. And Ana Maria Ibanez has researched the economic consequences of conflict as an economics professor at Colombia's Universidad de los Andes. She joins us from Yale University in Connecticut, where she's currently a visiting professor. Thanks to all of you for joining us. Ana Maria, the Colombian people rejected that deal with FARC in a referendum. Now changes have been made. The Colombian Congress have passed that new agreement. The question is this being imposed on the Colombian people? Are they on board?
Well, it's difficult to say that is imposed to the Colombian people. The plebiscite only won by 50,000 votes. And then the Colombian Congress is representing the Colombian people. So the referendum forced the government and FARC to negotiate a new peace agreement, which included most of the request of the opposition. It has one particular thing that was not included was political participation by FARC, which was impossible for them to accept that. But I wouldn't say it's an imposition. I mean, it's undergoing a democratic process, and the Congress is elected by the Colombian people.
Michael, is this a clear-cut deal? FARC is saying that they will not demobilize until certain what they call judicial obstructions are removed. Basically, they wanted that amnesty clause put in and implemented.
Yeah, I think that there's still this is, I think, is an important step, but there are a lot of concerns, and it's going to be complicated in legislation that has to follow to implement these accords, in decisions by the courts. This is going to be a complicated process, but I think I agree with Ana Maria that the Congress is a democratic institution. It was elected by the people, and the president chose this path. I think putting it up for a referendum, a plebiscite, again, would have been very risky, costly, would have taken more time, and I think there was concern that the situation would get worse, and so it was important to have something, a deal in place. But certainly looking forward, it's going to be difficult, and the country is polarized. There's no question about it on this issue. A lot of people who would not like this deal. There were some changes that were incorporated, many were not. And so certainly the leaders of the No campaign still are not on board with this deal.
And Michael, looking at the nuts and bolts of this agreement, it incorporates a timeline. Is the government and FARC going to able to meet that timeline?
Well, I think it remains to be seen. I mean, it's going to be, I think we could expect perhaps some delays. The situation in practice on the ground is usually more complicated. It takes more time than is expected, but I think that this is a war that's been an armed conflict that's been there since the early 1960s. Right. There's been enormous costs, and it's not going to end quickly. This is a deal that I think establishes a framework the Congress approved of, but I think the timeline could be expected to be some delays.
Diana, what's your take on why the Colombian people rejected this deal in the first place?
Well, I consider that there is, as Michael said before, a profound division about two aspects, and it's how FARC, the members of the FARC, are going to pay for their crimes. And if they have to go into the jail, or if they have to have this open window to have a political participation. So I believe that the half of the country who voted for the no on the referendum, they were thinking that they're trying to pursue a just deal where the victims have any kind of payment from the FARC, where there is an agreement that don't allow the members of the FARC to go to the Congress to have participation, to create a new party, or even to run to be president. They consider that we've been living for more than 5 decades under this conflict, and they have to pay and go to jail.
And then opponents of the deal were also unhappy with those clauses that involved amnesty for the rebels.
Yeah, exactly. It's we're talking about a peace agreement. Amnesty is one of the things that comes immediately to their minds, to the opposition, because they consider that, for example, when they accepting to just be rebel against to the government, they're not gonna have any consequences about it. We're talking about not only a movement that start fighting for the people in rural areas, but we're talking about for FARC who's kidnapping. They were killing people. More than 200 people died. More than 7 people were dropped by their homes. So it is more about amnesty and the wish that many Colombians have to see them behind or in jail now.
Ana Maria, looking at the deal itself, of course, there was that initial agreement which was on the table, which the Colombian people rejected. Then the government made changes to it, and Congress voted on it and passed it. What were the major changes that were made to that deal? And in that process of revising the original agreement, was FARC part of that process as well, the changes?
Yes, FARC was part of the process. So the process, first the government had several meetings with the opposition groups, and then they went to La Habana to negotiate the new agreement. It has several changes. First, with respect to the access to land and rural development point, it states clearly that the government and the agreement is going to respect private property, which was an important issue for the opposition people that oppose the agreement. And it also states clearly that in rural areas, rural development is going to be about small farmer producers, but also about the agro-industrial producers as well. The agreement also makes an important consideration. Before, the agreement was going to be part of the Constitution. Now the agreement is not going to be part of the Constitution, and it also watered down many of the transitional justice clauses that were favoring FARC. So FARC now are going to be confined in a more in geographical areas, in smaller geographical areas, and they will have to pay and restitute the victims of FARC, because that was in the previous agreement. It was very fuzzy, and it was not clear that they were going to need to restitute the victims with their own the money they have and the properties and the assets they have.
Michael, what's your view? Was the agreement diluted in a sense with these changes?
I think it was changed somewhat to accommodate some of the demands and the concerns of the opposition. But obviously, and I think that's a positive step. There was this process of consultation, as Ana Maria said, and then the government went back to the FARC and presented them, and that's what they arrived at. But obviously not enough for the people who were against. All of the leaders who opposed the original deal opposed this deal.
People who oppose this, what do they want?
They want what Dana said.
Yeah.
They're worried about. First of all, there's some controversy about the point about whether this goes into the Constitution or not. There's some people who interpret the deals as if this does come because of the Constitution. The government claims not. A lot of people claim not. But there are some people that I've spoken to who are leaders of the No campaign who are not convinced by that. So they're not satisfied with that part of it. And the big part is the political participation. that there should be sort of a reasonable time. If they pay if they go and they pay the cost of having committed crimes, after that they can. But this is something that's unacceptable to the leaders of the No campaign, and the government claims that the FARC wouldn't have accepted anything else. So there you have it.
And Diana, the FARC doesn't seem to be fully on board as well. We're hearing that many of its members are deserting. And that they're joining the smaller rebel national group, the National Liberation Army. There's even been killings that have continued to take place this year in rural parts of the country. What do we know about the fact that FARC could be breaking up?
Well, for the past, I think 8 years, more than 8 years, the FARC just changed this position on this conflict, because the government made a good job. They were fighting and trying to kill or capture the main leaders of the FARC. So they went to this negotiation under a different position, or a weak position, and that's why the government is trying to pursue them to go with this deal. But there are many risks involved, like it is possible that the conflict starts again, or that many members decide to don't go with the deal that they already signed. Not the main leaders of FARC, but other members of the FARC who just are feeling that they were fighting in a political fight, and then they don't feel any more represented. They don't feel like they're part of the FARC anymore. So they're going to try to be part of any other illegal organization, because we have to consider that it's not only the FARC. There are many other illegal groups in Colombia, like ELN and militias that continue with increasing violence in Colombia.
Ana Maria, many of the victims in this war have been people who live in very remote rural areas. What can you tell us about the ability of the government to secure these rural areas, these remote areas? In a sense, can the government win the hearts and minds of people who live out there?
That, and I consider, is one of the big challenges of the peace agreement. The peace agreement states that the government is indeed going to establish a stronger presence in rural areas, is going to increase investment, is going to guarantee property rights and provide land to small farm producers. But the state has been historically weak in that sense. And not only historically weak, but politically, they have been unwilling to invest in rural areas, and that's part of the causes of the conflict. So they established a timeline of 15 years to implement all this agreement on access to land and rural development, but we need really a political commitment from the government, from the Senate, and from all the state institutions to really carry through these commitments, and also to really strengthen the national institutions and the local institutions that are responsible for implementing the agreement. Let's hope that they are able to do it. There have been many instances in history when the national government of Colombia has put in place a plan to improve the conditions in the rural areas, and these plans have fallen. So one of my main concerns is that we may face again broken promises, but I think we have to try and see what happens and support the government throughout this process.
Okay, we are going to have to take a break right now. More of our conversation when we return. Stay with us. You're watching The Heat. Welcome back. We're talking about the recently ratified peace deal between the Colombian government and FARC rebels. Let's get back to our panel. Michael, you mentioned a moment ago that there is opposition to the deal on the political side, much of it led by the former president Alvaro Uribe. Is there anything that the political opposition has in its arsenal that could undermine this deal?
Well, they have popular support. Effective implementation requires cooperation with local authorities, with communities, and to the extent that that Uribe promotes this resistance and opposition to this, it makes it more complicated. So I think that's the problem. But let me just say, there's going to be a second plebiscite on the peace deal. The first one was rejected on October 2nd. The second one will be the next presidential elections in 2018, because this is going to be the issue. And of course, Uribe can't run again, but Uribe will have his candidate. who will represent an opposition to this agreement. And we're going to see the Colombian people have another opportunity to vote, because I think that's going to be the central issue.
So, Michael, that makes it really important for the government to show now that there is some peace dividend.
Absolutely. That, I think, is the strategy. Santos has until August of 2018 left, and I think what he wants to do is to show results quickly, and to try to convince people that this agreement was a good one, that it's working for them, that there is attention to neglected areas of the country, that the FARC, a lot of the FARC are being successfully reintegrated into society and are participating in the economy, and then people will say, this may not have been a bad deal, you know, I was skeptical, but I've been convinced, and then the election result will be different. But if they're not, if it's not done well, and they don't have the resources, and the questions that Ana Maria raised are not resolved, then Uribe and his party and his candidate will be in a strong position in 2018.
I want to comment on what Michael said, and is about that this political division, it's really important for the course of this peace agreement, especially because we've been seeing here in Washington, sometimes the former President Uribe doing lobby against the peace deal inside Congress. And then we saw almost 2 weeks ago President Santos coming to the Congress and talking with some of the members who are openly opposing to this deal, trying to convince them to approve this help from the U.S. government in a post-conflict scenario that is the Peace Colombia deal. And also we have to consider that the U.S. government is been supporting in a strong way this agreement. So I consider that this profound division with the political scenario behind, with the elections really close, it's one interesting fact in this process.
Right. And Maria, as Michael pointed out, the government would have to show results before the next election. So what are the sort of milestones or benchmarks in this process that we should be looking for in the months ahead?
Well, I think that we only have 2 years. It's going to be quite difficult, but basically the main challenges for them is to show that the most of the members of the FARC are demobilizing, and they are starting to do some demonstrations with victims trying to requesting or asking for forgiveness and telling what they did throughout this process. And I think that emotional part is going to play an important role. I really don't think the government is going to be able to start implementing the hardcore agreements on rural development and on other issues that they agreed upon. So it's basically an emotional process in which the FARC is going to start demobilizing. They are going to start telling the truth about part of what they did, and the victims are going to play an important role throughout this process. But it's going to be challenging for Santos because the opposition is articulate, it has a strong popular support, and Uribe is really aiming for the 2018 election in which his candidate wins.
Michael, how difficult is it going to be for FARC to extricate itself from being a guerrilla group to becoming something more of a mainstream group in Colombia? For instance, it ran the cocaine trade in Colombia, made a lot of money out of that. There's one figure that says, or two figures rather, that says it made between $200 million and $3.5 billion a year, and that it's got $10 billion stashed away in foreign bank accounts. How difficult is that going to be?
It's going to be very difficult, and I think it's unrealistic to expect that all of the FARC will completely extricate itself from the drug trade. They've made this commitment. It's part of the peace deal. I think the leadership is behind it, but there's a rank and file members of the FARC that are making a lot of money, that are doing well, and it's going to be very, very hard for them to leave it. I think we have to be realistic about what's going to happen. It's not that the whole FARC is going to sort of become demobilized, reintegrated. There's going to be a part of the FARC that is going to continue to be involved in illegal activity, whether the drug trade, illegal mining, there are other illegal illicit activities in Colombia, and the temptations and the incentives are great. And so I think you should see this as a positive step, but it doesn't mean that it's going to end the illegal activity. The drug trade is a big problem. The drugs production is way up. That's partly because of the FARC and the agreement itself, which said that those people who cultivated coca would get special treatment and resources, and of course that was an incentive for people to produce coca, because they would fall under this. They would be beneficiary of this peace deal. So this is a concern. President Santos is well aware of it. It's going to be a big issue here in the U.S. Congress in terms of support going forward. There's a lot of concern about the increase in coca production. It's gone to levels that it was many years ago, and returned to those high levels. And this is going to be a challenge both in Bogota as well as in Washington, the politics in Washington.
What do you think, Diana? As Michael says, it's going to be a big challenge. How difficult is it going to be for the government to tell the farmers, stop growing coca, grow bananas now?
Yeah, I totally agree with Michael, because the coca numbers are increasing. So now with this new administration under the next president of the United States, Trump, and his party also controlling the Congress, there's going to be a hard debate, especially for the debate for the budget, for this help that it's providing, that it's going to provide the U.S. government, and especially because most of those members of Congress that are opposing to this deal consider that they have to provide more proofs on the side of the government that they're respecting the human rights, the voices of the opposition, and that they're not continue with this illegal traffic of drugs in Colombia.
All right, but broadly speaking, do you expect that there will still be continued support even under the new administration for this peace deal?
Yeah, and I think that the main reason is that the Plan Colombia was a successful plan for United States. Our country was like a failed state, or some people call it failed state, 15 years ago, and it was a positive transition. And this process just is one example that we have a strong democracy, that we hear the voices of the opposition, and we want to move on. So I consider that the support from U.S. is going to continue, but I think the debate about the budget for this support, it's going to be a tough fight for the Colombian government, especially under this new administration with the next President Trump.
Ana Maria, this war lasted 52 years, killed hundreds of thousands of people, millions more were forced out of their homes, were displaced. What did this do to Colombia? How much damage did it cause?
The damage was immense, and I'm an economist, so basically what I have done is to study the economic cost of conflict, and what we have found is that the economic cost of conflict are huge. People, the education levels are lower because of that, the health of the people deteriorated. We had about almost 7 million displaced people that lost 7.4 million of hectares of land. And this, of course, had a huge impact on agricultural production in the country. So the studies that we have done show that each year we are losing about 0.5 percentage points of agricultural GDP because of the conflict and because of all this process. I could give you much more figures, but the main message that I would like to send is that the costs have been immense. The economic cost. But also, if you look at the country, we have now today a country that is polarized, that has a large percentage of people, a large percentage of the population facing post-traumatic stress and a large number of victims, and it's going to be a difficult path ahead. Even if the peace agreement is successfully implemented, we still need decades to recover from this process.
Michael, on the question of how Colombia moves on from here, things like foreign investment, your organization, the Inter-American Dialogue, provided us with some figures. China, the other big player in Latin America, granted Colombia a $75 million loan in 2014. Now, that's relatively small compared to the investments that China has been making in Venezuela or in Brazil. Is that likely to change now with this deal?
Well, we'll see what the conditions are. I think there's going to be a wait-and-see attitude to see how this moves forward. There was just a meeting in Cartagena, Colombia, recently with major CEOs of multinational companies to try to promote and motivate investment in Colombia. I think there's interest. I think people see enormous promise. But right now, we have a deal that's been agreed to. but the country still has enormous problems. And I think to the extent that we could begin to see at least something begin to happen in terms of implementation, that will encourage. The Chinese haven't really been as involved in Colombia. Like you said, that's a relatively small, minor figure. If you look at a lot of other Latin American countries, China is not a big factor in Colombia compared to other countries. But I do think in terms of U.S. investment and other investors, there's going to be a lot of interest. They're going to be following very closely how this unfolds and whether this deal is actually put in practice.
And that's where we have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for joining us. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us.